All right, what is up, folks? Welcome back to another episode of the Help Me Understand podcast. I'm your host, JK, and let's jump right in and set the scene for today's episode. Let's start with some context, a story. Let's say that you have set a goal of working out 3 times per week. Then you look back and you reflect 3 to 4 weeks later, and you didn't quite hit that goal. Maybe you're averaging once or twice a week at best. So what do? Well, over and over, what I have observed is that your response is, okay, well, you know what? My goal was 3. I've hit 1 to 2. So next month, I'm going to aim for 5. So if that particular scenario sounds familiar to you, I want to let you know that you're not alone. It is a pattern that I do tend to see very, very regularly. So I've also been there myself previously. And I want to spend some time today talking to you about what I'm going to call the goal setting paradox. So before going any further in today's episode, I, as always, want to say thank you for choosing to press play on the Help Me Understand podcast. I know that you have a lot of different podcast content that you can consume, so I certainly never take it for granted that you chose to press play on Help Me Understand. So let's get back into today's topic that for right now, I'm going to call the goal setting paradox. So we've got that scenario that I described to you where you set a particular goal, you fall short of that, and then you decide to, for lack of a better way to put it, let's raise the bar or set a goal that's even more, what's the word that I'm looking for? Not audacious, but basically let's set a bigger goal when I haven't met the previous goal that I had before. So today I want to dig into what I discovered that I thought might be kind of interesting to share with you, some perspective on why we do that. So basically why we raise the bar when we haven't even hit the goal that we set in the first place. So I'm going to dig into that and also share with you some thoughts that I've got on what you can do instead so that you can actually continue to make progress. So first, let's lay the scenario here. You've got the multiple workouts per week that you say you're going to do, but you don't do. Another very common one that I will run into, and this one very often in having conversations just casually at the gym when it comes to tracking food. People will say, well, I know that you talk a lot about first doing an assessment of trying to get an understanding of where your nutrition actually is. So I've decided that I'm going to either track my macros or create a food log where I'm just writing down everything that I eat. I'm going to do that for 3 days out of the week. And then I'll see them a few weeks later and ask, so what did you discover? And they said, I tracked or wrote down my food maybe like 1 day out of the week and then totally fell off. But don't worry, man, I'm going to get right back at it. And I'm actually just going to track everything every single day. So these are a couple of examples that I run into. And then one other one that I definitely run into is folks, whether it doesn't necessarily have to do with working out or nutrition, it's more like steps. I'm going to go for a 10-minute walk 4 days a week, like you suggested. That seems definitely doable. I'm basically averaging 2,000 to 3,000 steps a day at most. So I know I can go for a 10-minute walk. Again, talk to them a few weeks later. Hey, how's that been going? Man, I was able to stick with it for that first week, but then the second week, I forgot I had this and that going on. But don't worry, I'm going to get after it. And actually what I'm going to be doing is I will for sure get in 10,000 steps every single day this upcoming month. And the challenge with that is it feels like you're being ambitious. It feels like you're really getting after it, but it's actually like a mental trick. So we think that setting a bigger goal is going to push us harder, but it ends up totally backfiring. So I got really curious around this because it's something that a behavior pattern that I see fairly often. And I wanted to get a little bit more information or at least get some additional perspective on, is there some sort of science behind this, or is it just one of those anecdotal things? And the internet did not let me down. We're actually going to talk today about something called false hope syndrome that is a part of this. So before getting into that, let's describe like what's really going on. And many times in instances like this, where you set a goal and you don't reach that goal, so you set a bigger goal thinking that that's what you need to do in order to hit it, but then you don't hit that particular goal, you start to beat yourself up because you think that it's about you being lazy, you being undisciplined, or you having a lack of effort. And I would actually argue that it's not right off the bat, it's not any of those three things. It's actually more about misalignment and you not really taking the time to understand that in order to get to, for example, 5 workouts per week, first you've got to consistently do 1 per week, then 2 per week, then 3 per week, and so on. So it's not about the fact that you're lazy. It's not about the fact that you're undisciplined. You're just setting goals that are not aligned with where you currently are right now. It can also be part of all or nothing thinking, where you just think, well, if I can't do all of it, so if I can't get in 10,000 steps, then what's the point in getting in another 10-minute walk? If I'm not going to get in 5 workouts, then what's the point of me getting in this 3rd workout this week because I'm not going to hit my goal of 5? So that's that all or nothing thinking. It starts to cause this internal friction also because it starts to mess with your identity. So it causes like an identity conflict. So you begin to think like, man, I'm not being who I said I was going to be. I'm never going to be like the fittest version of myself that I want to be, or that sort of internal talk that happens. And we get into this loop of trying to prove our way out of inconsistency instead of actually trying to solve why the inconsistency is there. And I'm all about people taking ownership over their behaviors, their actions, and their decisions. So it can be very easy to take that ownership, that sense of self-ownership that you feel and I can definitely identify with, and say, well, it's my fault and I'm to blame because I wasn't disciplined enough. When again, in fact, it tends to be more about not setting targets at the level that you currently are at. So again, it starts to create this identity conflict. So I mentioned something just about a minute ago about something that I found called false hope syndrome. And I found this to be really interesting. So there's two psychologists, Janet Polivy and Peter Herman. And what they did, they're 2 psychologists, and they basically phrased this theory, we'll call it, or this syndrome. They call it the false hope syndrome. And the way that they discovered this was they did a lot of different long-term observations, primarily of like dieting and weight loss behaviors. And a lot of the snippets that I found was work that they did with specifically chronic dieters. So what they did is they did a lot of controlled psychological experiments on things like goal setting, self-regulation, and also eating behaviors. So what they did was during these particular studies, they did an analysis of the different relapse patterns in, again, the areas like fitness and their eating habits. And one of the things that they specifically honed in on was tracking how often people recycled unrealistic goals and then how each failure led to even more extreme future goals instead of smaller ones, which you may be listening to this and say to yourself, well, yeah, well, maybe you're somebody who's been in the fitness game for a long time, and you say to yourself, well, yeah, that doesn't make sense that people would be setting these unrealistic goals and things like that. And I'm here to tell you that as someone who works with folks who are somewhat experienced in the fitness game, I do work from time to time with people who are newer to specifically strength training and just the basics of nutrition. Those would be people I typically will work with more in person versus online. However, I can tell you that with working with mostly people who have some level of experience, generally my avatar is folks who've been doing things for a while and just feel like they should feel better, look better, and be able to lift more than they can based on how much work that they've quote unquote put in over a number of years. I can tell you that I still see this same exact pattern all the time at all levels. And in fact, I have a handful of clients who have more lifting experience than me. If you don't know my backstory, I'm currently in my mid 40s and I started lifting at the age of about 31. And I work with a lot of women specifically who are in their mid 40s and older, and they started lifting actually much earlier or got into athletics much earlier. I certainly did not. I've got a couple of people who were former college athletes. So just to let you know, this particular pattern of behavior, this false hope syndrome, is across the board. It does not discriminate. So back to Polivy and Herman. So one common method that they used was they would put participants into these structured behavior change programs like diets or habit routines. And so they really focused on three specific things. So those three specific things that they focused on was: one, how did people set their goals? Two, how long did they stick to them? And then three, how they reacted when things didn't go as planned. And what was kind of cool is that by studying these things, this allowed them to spot some sort of like a predictable emotional and behavioral cycle around different change efforts. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So that's the work that they did. And this is how they created, or how they devise, the concept of false hope syndrome. So the way that they explain false hope syndrome, it's a common pattern where people repeatedly set overly ambitious goals for personal change, like dieting, exercising, or quitting bad habits, and then they spiral through this cycle of short-term effort, failure, and then set even bigger goals. So I jotted down some bullet points on some patterns that they identified. And if any of this sounds like you're not alone. Okay. You are definitely not alone. In fact, I have recently had talked about this very same concept with no less than 2 people in the past 3 weeks, like very specifically talked to them about this particular pattern over the last 2 weeks. So this is the pattern that they identified. So step 1, you set the unrealistic goal. So I'm going to work out like 6 days a week, and I'm going to cut out all sugar, and I'm going to do fasting. Cool. So step 1, an unrealistic goal gets set. Then there's step number 2. You have that initial burst of motivation. You nail it. Everything is perfect. The person feels super fired up, and they maybe even see some results early on. Then we hit step number 3, typically the messy middle. Reality starts to kick in. So life starts to get busy. That initial pump of motivation, it starts to fade, and then they start to fall, quote unquote, off track. So they're no longer hitting the 6 days a week, the cutting out all sugar, that doesn't really stick. And then the intermittent fasting, excuse me. Ooh, that's a slip. Intermittent fasting window slowly gets smaller and smaller. So that reality kicks in. Then they move into the next step, which is disappointment and self-blame. So instead of them blaming the unrealistic plan or identifying that the plan itself was unrealistic to begin with, they basically practice like toxic ownership, and they blame themselves for their failings. So the next step that they take is, okay, cool, I'm just going to set the next goal. So that's the next step. They set the next goal even bigger. I just need to push harder. I just need to try harder. I just need to, as the kids say, I just need to lock in. So I'll go all in next time. I feel like my generation, we use all in, and then my son's generation talks about like lock in. Like that's just basically the way that it goes. So these are the patterns. This is the pattern that was identified. So again, just to review those. Step 1, unrealistic goal gets set. Step 2, you have the initial burst of motivation. Step 3, reality kicks in. Step 4, there's disappointment and self-blame. And then step number 5, the next goal, you set it even bigger. So if you are somebody like myself who is thinking, man, I realized that was a pattern, but I didn't know there was an actual theory around this, or a concept that somebody put some actual structure around. Well, appreciate you tuning into the Help Me Understand podcast, because there is a name for it, and it's called the false hope syndrome. So why this particular concept really matters and why I think it's important to talk about it is because what happens is when you have a pattern developed like this, it's about more than just missing your workouts. It's about more than eating before 12 p.m., which was your intermittent fasting window. It's about more than eating a Twix bar when you said that you weren't going to eat sugar. It's about more than all of that. Creating this particular pattern starts to erode self-trust. So again, all along, you are overcommitting and under delivering, and you reinforce this story of, well, I can't stick to anything. And I'm certainly not here to tell you that you don't play a role in that, not by any means. What I'm here to tell you, though, is that you're respectfully going about the process in the wrong way. You're setting yourself up for the failure. So every time that you set a goal and you miss it, and then you move the goalpost or you raise the bar, then you're just setting yourself up to fail again and again. So you really want to work on trying to reframe your goal. And this is what I'll get into here to kind of give you some actionable tips that you can look at. So what you want to do is reframe your goal and think to yourself, okay, it's the cliche saying, like, it's not about trying harder, it's about planning smarter. And I truly do believe that many times that is the case. We can get into all the nuances of sometimes you just do need to work harder. Yes, sometimes you do need to work harder. Are you working harder at the right things, though? That's the challenge that I will often present to people when they like push back on well, it's not about, sometimes people just do need to work hard. Yes, I absolutely agree. But if you're working hard at digging the when you're supposed to be working hard at filling the hole, that you're going to spiral. You're not going to get anywhere. So just to share with you, just keep in mind, you can't continue to keep stacking higher and higher and higher goals, and you continue to do that on a shaky foundation. You have to, at some point, if you actually want to move the needle forward, if you actually want to build, at some point, you have to address the foundation. You are just going to have to do that. All right, so now let's get into what you can actually do instead and what are some very simple and actionable strategies. And I went back in some of my notes and kind of harkened back to the days of Atomic Habits. That's one of my favorite books of all time. I believe right now that's the book that I've got in my line of sight for the first book that we're going to use for the the foundational fitness habits community, free community that I started. We're doing a book club, and I believe that I'm going to use Atomic Habits. So stay tuned for that if you are part of the Fitness Foundation community. So number one, shrink the habit to match your real life. So if you are currently getting in 1 to 2 workouts a week, then 2 workouts per week is the target that I would co-sign on you getting in. So again, shrink the habit to match your life. So if you're only getting in 1 to 2, or not only, excuse me, if you're getting in 1 to 2 workouts per week right now, then let's start with consistently getting in 2 as the target, as opposed to let's set it to 5. So first, I want you to win there, because that consistency, is going to build the trust, the self-efficacy that you need, that you prove to yourself, I can do this, and then potentially you can start to stack. I say potentially because for some folks, they will realize that 2 is where they primarily should be as their foundation the entire time. So this whole well, let's start with 2 per week and eventually we'll work our way up to 5. Sometimes that's true, and then sometimes it's not. So just keep that in mind. Secondly, what you can do as far as making some changes, focus on what your follow through is going to be and not some fantasy that you've created. So instead of chasing the idea of what should happen, I want you to really focus on actually the follow through. So instead of focusing on, okay, well, if I nail these 5 workouts per week, then that means I'm going to build this amount of muscle and all of these other things. Well, first focus on following through with the 2 workouts per week. So hitting 2 workouts per week consistently is way better than aiming for 5 and then still kind of finishing with the 2 anyway. I know there's that saying out there, something along the line of set the goal high and, shoot for the moon or something like that. And even if you miss it, you land in the stars or something like that. That doesn't apply here. So I am all about sayings and motivational things on walls. I have flags behind me and the whole nine. I'm all good with that. Remember back in the day, those accessories posters that would be a picture of some landscape, like a mountain or something like that. And it would say teamwork, success, focus. I was that guy. I had those things on my desk. And also those things don't always apply in everything. So the whole shoot for the moon, because then you might land for the stars, that doesn't apply in every situation when you keep missing every single time. So hopefully I didn't just demotivate somebody. And lastly, but surely not least, and this totally fits with I believe my vibe, my brand, if you want to call it that, my reputation, and the work that I hope to do with you who may be listening, if you're not a member already of the Fitness Foundations community, is to really work on building your foundation, build the floor, and then you start to raise the ceiling. So again, I talked earlier about you continue to stack and stack and stack. Well, as you're stacking more on, as you're stacking more things on top of your foundation, you need to periodically go back and make sure that your foundation is actually in pretty good shape. It's like somebody continuing, in a 3-story house, somebody continuing to remodel the first floor and the second floor and never addressing the fact that the foundation of the home has slowly been eroding over a number of years. So if we get back to the training example or the workout example, once you're solid at 2, maybe 3 days per week, then consider adding more. But starting with getting that consistent 2 in, and then all of a sudden jump into 5, it's like, whoa, buddy, like let's step it back for a moment. We go from 2 to then 3 potentially, then we go to 4, and so on. So let your habits stack, not just stretch out all the time. Okay. So let's go ahead and start bringing things to a close. So just to recap a handful of things here. Remember that when you miss a particular goal, take that time to pause, reflect, analyze, and review and figure out, okay, is the problem my lack of execution, or is it more towards, because it could be a bit of both, is it more towards I didn't set a realistic goal? And you may be thinking to yourself, well, how would I know? How would I know that my goal was unrealistic versus I was just lazy with my time? Well, do a time audit and take a look. So if you very, very regularly, when somebody is going back and doing a time audit and we're trying to figure out, okay, was it a bad plan or bad execution? And this was a concept that I implemented years and years ago in business. And I found that in coaching, this is prior to me getting into coaching people, I have found that this has been helpful, and I'll probably always use it as a structure. When something doesn't work out the way that you want it to, you go back and you look, okay, was it bad plan or bad execution? And the way that you know that it was bad execution is that you look back and the plan was totally unrealistic. It didn't, and one of the red flags there is that it doesn't take into account all of the current available resources. So if you're talking about working out 5 days per week and you currently don't have an hour and a half or an hour or even a half hour where someone else is able to watch your kids or whatever other responsibilities that you have, so that you can go to a gym, and say you don't have stuff at home and you just are not into like doing home workouts, whatever it may be, then that would be a bad plan, because you made all of these plans based on resources that you didn't have. So that can be a real tell right off the top, is did the plan take into account all of these different variables? Now, I don't want that to have you thinking, okay, well, I shouldn't start to do anything until I have A, B, C, D, E, F figured out. No, you may only have A and B figured out. Make your plan based on A and B and then start to execute from there. Okay, so when we're looking at, is it bad plan or bad execution? A good plan, a great plan takes into account all of the available resources and starts from there. So then if you aren't able to execute, or if you don't execute and the time was available, the resources were there, so it was let's say a 20-minute body weight workout 3 times a week, and it just for you're just like, I just wasn't jazzed about doing that. Like, I just didn't want to do that. That had nothing to do with the plan. That was you just didn't feel like it. So that's totally different. So keep that in mind, that just because something doesn't go the way that you believe it should go doesn't always mean that it comes down to a bad plan. It may be bad execution or vice versa. So keep in mind, again, if you are going through a particular process and you don't meet that goal, the next best move, in my experience, is not to then make the goal even more difficult. It's to go back and reevaluate, think about the different points that I brought up when talking about this false hope syndrome, and try to get an understanding of, okay, I may have failed. It doesn't mean that I'm a failure. What can I do going forward? What can I do to take the next best step? So, reflection for you. What's one goal that you've been inflating that needs to come back down to earth? So that's the question I've got for you. What is one goal that you've been inflating that needs to come back down to earth. So, in closing, if this resonated with you, please send it to someone who you think may be potentially in this particular cycle. Pass this episode on to them, whether it's a friend, family member, or if it's somebody that you don't like, but you just want them to stop perpetuating this false hope syndrome cycle. I would greatly appreciate if you sent them this particular episode. All right, just a couple of housekeeping things to close things out. As always, this episode is brought to you by Feed Your Habits. Feed Your Habits is an apparel brand that's built around action, intention, and showing up on purpose. So whether you're in the gym, out on a walk, or just handling life, Feed Your Habits gear is designed to remind you that habits don't grow on their own, they get fed. So as a friendly reminder, listeners of this show do get 10% off and free US shipping if you use my code in all caps, JKFYH at checkout. That will get you 10% off. So just swing on over to feedyourhabits.com and grab something that represents the work that you are putting in. And then certainly not last, reach out to me either via Instagram or my email if you are interested in joining the free fitness foundations community. We just kicked off a couple of days ago as of the release of this particular episode. It is a 100% free community. We are in the building stages right now, and the only ticket to entry, the only price you would need to pay to be in the community is you have to do an intro post to introduce yourself. That is literally all that it costs right now. So get in while you can. Just hit me up on Instagram or email me. My information will be in the show notes. Would love to have you in there as we are building something that I believe strongly is going to be something really special. And I want your help with doing that. So with that, thank you as always for tuning in to another episode of the Help Me Understand podcast. I appreciate you. Take care, and we'll talk next time.